All right, y'all, welcome back. Okay, this is going to be Rousseau, lecture 3, 4, something like that. We're at book 2, chapter 4, Limits of the Sovereign Power. So, despite having an obligation to the state, Rousseau asks, what rights of liberty do citizens enjoy simply as being human? And he says, quote, every service a citizen can render the state he ought to render as soon as the sovereign demands it. But the sovereign, for its part, cannot impose upon its subjects any fetters that are useless to the community. And here, Rousseau's argument against slavery and segregation really shine. He says, quote, this proves that equality of rights and the idea of justice which such quality creates originate in the preference each man gives to himself and accordingly to the very nature of man. So he's saying this is all built on the idea of selfishness of humankind, and yet it works for the better. He says it proves that the general will, to be really such, must be general in its object as well as its essence, that it must both come from all and apply to all, and that it loses its natural rectitude when it is directed to some particular and determinate object, because in such a case we are judging of something foreign to us and have no true principle of equity to guide us. So he's saying that the sovereign should be there to provide benefits to the community at large, to all in the community, right? And that focusing on particularities and on individual groups or citizens and giving them benefits over others is not the general will. He goes on to say, from whatever side we approach our principle, we reach the same conclusion, that the social compact sets up among the citizens an equality of such a kind that they all bind themselves to observe the same conditions and should therefore all enjoy the same rights. And so he basically just lays down the golden rule here, so that the sovereign recognizes only the body of the nation and draws no distinction between those of whom it is made up. So the sovereign must be focused on the community at large, not individuals, not single corporations, not individual politicians, not white people or black people or Hispanics. It should be about the entire population. He breaks down the social compact very succinctly, and he gives us some rules. 1, it must be legitimate because it is based on a social contract. 2, it is equitable because it is common to all. 3, it is useful because it can have no other object than the common good. And 4, it is stable because it is guaranteed by public force and supreme power. So long as the subjects have to submit only to conventions of this sort, they obey no one but their own will and the will of the community. And then he also finally touches on military service at the very end of the chapter. And he says, all have indeed to fight when their country needs them, but then no one has ever to fight for himself. So we do have an obligation to serve. Okay. Chapter 5, The Right of Life and Death. Rousseau believes that citizens cannot take their own lives, like suicide is not allowed, but that the state does have the right to take a citizen's life. And he lays down some rules here. He says, when the prince says to him, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because it is only on that condition that he has been living in security up to the present, and because his life is no longer a mere bounty of nature, but a gift made conditionally by the state. So this goes back to Socrates and Plato's argument, right? That you have been given this great life by the state, and so you owe the state if the state has a legitimate reason to put you down, basically. And this is very much in line with the Crito argument, right? And Rousseau suggests that criminals who have been given trial and been found guilty can be killed. And sometimes it is the duty of the state to kill them. They broke the covenant and have become traitors to the social contract. Quote, By violating its laws, he ceases to be a member of it. He even makes war upon it. In such a case, the preservation of the state is inconsistent with his own, and one or the other must perish. In putting the guilty to death, we slay not so much the citizen as an enemy of the state. Now, however, Rousseau says that most citizens are rehabilitative, and that the state cannot put those who can be rehabilitated to death. These are only for the worst of the worst, right? The most heinous criminals who repeatedly commit crimes and cannot be rehabilitated, right? Ted Bundy and some of these just ultra criminals who are sociopaths and have no empathy for humankind and no intention of ever following the law. And then Rousseau also argues that good and just societies simply don't have a lot of crime, and that high crime and high rates of recidivism are signs that we have social decay and a delegitimated state. And that's a really good argument, actually. It's worrisome that some countries, especially some developed countries, have such high crime rates, like Greece, Italy, arguably the United States of America, whereas a lot of states don't really have those kind of crime rates. If you look at like Finland, Sweden, of course they have crime, but not nearly to the extent or the amount of violence that exists in some other places. Okay, chapter 6, the law. Basically, Rousseau says that justice, quote unquote, makes men fools without a proper state. He says, quote, humanly speaking, in default of natural sanctions, the laws of justice are ineffective among men. They merely make for the good of the wicked and the undoing of the just, when the just man observes them towards everybody and nobody observes them toward him, right? So if we live in this state of anarchy where we have not made the social compact, if I try to be a moral person, I'm a fool, right? Because I'm just going to be taken advantage of. It kind of made me laugh because he's absolutely right. Okay, what makes a law, quote unquote, like his definition of what a law is in this social compact? He says, first, it cannot be aimed at a particular person or group. So he's hit on this point over and over, right? We cannot particularize. We must make it for the common good, or it is not a just law. It must be considered to apply to all equally. So he's made this point multiple times too. Just because you're a politician, just because you're the king, does not mean that you are not subject to the same laws as your citizens, because you are a citizen under the law. And then he makes a nice list of what a real law is, right? He says, we at once see that it can no longer be asked whose business it is to make laws, since that they are, 1, acts of the general will, 2, nor whether the prince is above the law, since he is a member of the state, 3, nor whether the law can be unjust, since no one is unjust to himself, and 4, nor how we can be both free and subject to the laws, since they are but registers of our will. So if we're doing the laws right, and we're making them for everybody, and we're living by the golden rule, everyone is still free because they want these laws. And then Rousseau claims that states run in this manner, by definition, are what he calls republics, right? States that are run under a civil set of rules agreed upon by all of the community under a social contract. This is what we call a republic. Of itself, the people wills always the good, but of itself, it by no means always sees it. And so he says this is the scary thing, right? We always want the greater good, but we're often manipulated or led astray. He says, clear and honest communication is vital to getting as close to a republic as possible. Quote, it must be shown the good road it is in search of, secured from the seductive influences of individual wills, taught to see time and space as a series, and made to weigh the attractions of present and sensible advantages against the danger of distant and hidden evils. So this is very difficult, and we touched on this earlier, is that leaders and the state itself, right, arguably have the best information, while citizens have very poor, inaccurate, often just flat out wrong, and man, what would you even call it? Propagandistic, right? From both sides, right and left in this country. And so nobody really knows what the clear, honest truth. It seems to become a smaller and smaller group every day of people who are reading actual information, right? And so how does a citizenry choose what's best for it if the state does not allow for it to have a clear idea of what the best is, the common good is? Okay. You know what? No, we'll do one more. We're going to do the legislator, chapter 7. So Rousseau touches on who a legislator is and what is their role. And Rousseau says that a pure legislator can never really be real, and that we must have checks to ensure that legislators keep the public will under consideration and not their own when they make laws, right? And so it is very, very difficult. And even Hobbes touched on this, where it's really hard to keep your representatives on track with the common good rather than their own good, right? He also says that the sovereign and the legislators cannot be the same, and there must be a separation of powers. So this is, again, where he differentiates strongly with Hobbes. Because remember, Hobbes is like, oh, yeah, monarchy and dictatorship, that's the best system. And Rousseau's like, no, bullshit, dude. We've got to have checks and balances so that we can keep the common good under the legislator and the executive's minds, and we need to keep them separate from each other. And then he also says that all votes should be put before an absolute vote, like a plebiscite, before the people, before becoming an actual law. And so, you know, this is kind of a rare thing. We have these sometimes in America, especially sort of on the East Coast, or the West Coast, and on the Northeast, where the original colonies were, where they'll have plebiscites, or referendum, or direct democracy, whatever you want to call it. In Texas, occasionally we have it. If the Texas wants to change the Constitution and put an amendment, the citizens have to vote on amendments to the Texas Constitution. It's pretty rare. But this is what he's saying has to be done, is that once a law has been agreed on by the legislative body, it should be put to a vote by the people. Now, how we can actually do that, and under what circumstances, because we've talked about before, like, you know, how do you talk about Iranian versus American nuclear stockpiles and you know, war plans for attacking Iran if something ever goes wrong, or our weapon munitions and shipping to Ukraine so that Russia doesn't get their hands on them. How do you talk to your citizens about that kind of thing? Like, some things are just plainly off limits. Anyway, okay, we'll move on. Rousseau also points out that there are some logical inconsistencies in making laws. He says, quote, the legislator, therefore, being unable to appeal to either force or to reason, must have recourse to an authority of a different order, capable of constraining without violence and persuading without convincing. He claims that this was overcome formerly by simply telling the people that power comes from God, so that they have to just obey, right? Where does legitimacy come from? And he says, we can't do that anymore, right? And he takes a pretty heavy shot at religion here, and the idea of religion as being a legitimate source of power, right? And he says, quote, any man may grave tablets of stone, or buy an oracle, or feign secret intercourse with some divinity, or train some bird to whisper in his ear, or find other vulgar ways of imposing on the people. So he's calling them like religious shams, right? So he takes a serious shot here. All right, we're going to call it there, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks for being here.